Where is the little old New York? The one that I used to know long, long ago. Where are the lovely sights I cheered for? All of the magic has just disappeared, for only the memories live on. New York, oh, where have you gone? Bring back my little old.
Once upon a time in New York City, we were kids. On summer nights, we played into the darkness, got punished for missing dinner. But what did it matter? What did anything matter? We were young. We were going to live forever.
Long, long
Frightened. I mean, I haven't seen him in 30 years. Haven't seen him in 50 years.
I'm up from Annapolis, Maryland.
I don't understand why these old people are claiming to be my contemporaries.
He never graduated.
He didn't have to graduate. They threw him out.
Some members of the New Utrecht High School class of 43 are gathered for a reunion. It's been 50 years.
It was a wonderful reunion. I hadn't seen most of these people for 50 years, and of course, it was very sad in a way because some people weren't there that I would have liked to see. But some friend came in from Jacksonville, Florida, and we were very close. And it was just wonderful seeing her.
We didn't do exotic things. We did the simple things and everybody enjoyed them. We didn't have the money to even dream about doing anything, so we really stayed in the neighborhood for the most part.
New York back then was neighborhoods, and neighborhoods had real borders. They were as self-contained as many countries are today.
I was born and raised in South Jamaica, Queens, 9540 150th Street, which was literally on the other side of the tracks from Kings Park and Jamaica Hill, where the people who lived in houses lived. Next door was the Pedalis family. They were Greek. And the Svitliks, they were Czechs. And the Russos, who were Italian. Next to them were the Kellys and the Fosters. The Fosters were Jewish. The Kellys were Irish. Across the street was a Portuguese-American bar and grill, a black bar, and an Italian bar on one block. Oh, and 2 blocks away was St. Monica's Catholic Church. I was a Shabbos goy in the synagogue and an altar boy at St. Monica's Church. That was the old neighborhood.
There was the couple of blocks of Jewish families, and then there were a couple of blocks of Italians, and there was the Irish and the Polish. And you didn't enter the other territory unless invited.
We lived in an ethnic group where we had Irish in one area, black,
American
Italians,
black in one area, Italians,
and
then West Indian blacks.
I lived in a 4-family house in East New York, and everyone in the house was related. They were all my mother's sisters, and her mother lived there. And my cousins and I were the same age. Once you finished your homework, you were free, and you could do whatever you want.
I lived in what you'd call a tenement house today. On the 4th floor, a 5-floor walk up, a lot of kids in the building, no playroom, no room really in the house for a lot of kids to play, but on the landings of the steps, that's where we'd play. Doors were open, neighbors were friendly. It was like one big commune.
Neighborhoods were closest in summertime. On warm evenings, people simply moved outside. The street became a village green. They played, they sang, and naturally, they gossiped. But the exchange, for better or worse, was always human.
There was always a milk box in front of one of the dairy grocers. We'd sit on a milk box, or we'd sit on a stoop. You know, stoop was a great gathering place. And the candy store was the hangout.
My mother would give me 1 penny, and the owner of the store would walk up and down the aisle with me, perusing over my shoulder as I perused all the candy. And he would spend 20 minutes with me while I was deciding how to spend my 1 penny. 1 penny in those days, believe it or not, was a lot of money in a candy store.
Over the marble counter of the soda fountain came 2-cent plains, egg creams, malteds, even banana splits. There seemed no end to neighborhood delights.
This was called Charlotte Russe. Charlotte Russe, that's sponge cake, whipped cream, not out of a can, not out of a, and a cherry. Oh, these were great, yeah.
People met daily at neighborhood stores, and through such meetings, neighborhood became community. Years before Visa or American Express, there was Segovsky credit.
And Mrs. Segovsky had an old grocery store. She was a woman, she built like a handball court, and she used to have a big book. You know, we used to come in there and say, Mrs. Gus, give me a bottle of milk, and give me a couple of rolls, and give me a box of sugar. And then she'd say, "Where's the money?" And I'd say, "My mother said she'll give you Tuesday." So she'd write it down. And that, I don't know how many families she literally supported or helped subsidize during those tough days. She was a great lady.
When people couldn't go to the stores came to them. Vendors of all kinds came down streets and up alleys, each calling their unique cries to the rooftops.
The Iceman came to deliver ice, and for 25 cents you got a chunk of ice, which you brought upstairs to your apartment, and you put it into your ice box prior to refrigerators.
There was a guy that would collect old clothes. Regzachen. That means literally, old shoes, and I'll buy, and cloth things. It's a Yiddish term.
Ball games with all sorts of mysterious rules were played with whatever props were available, but always with a bouncing pink beauty known as a Spalding.
This is a Spalding. I know it reads Spalding, but we always called it Spalding. And in New York, we could play all kinds of games with a Spalding. Box ball, punch ball, stick ball, handball, stoop ball.
The streets may have been intended for traffic, but kids knew they were really for play. The cry from kids if a car moved too slowly through their game was, "Get a horse."
Of course, we played all kinds of games with the Spalding. This is box ball, played on the sidewalks of New York City. You're supposed to hit it into your opponent's box on one bounce, you see? It goes back and forth, and of course, you try to put a little spin on it, as I did that time, and I win the point.
Ring Olivio with two sides hunting each other down. You know, one side hunted the other down, put them in a place, and then held them until the last man was out, then they went out. And anybody from one team could run into what was called home. And if you could get past the defenders and leap in, you could liberate everybody by yelling "home free all," which strikes me as one of the great phrases.
We used to play hopscotch, you know, drawing thing, roller skate. We used to roller skate all of the time because that's something we could do in the street.
If necessity is the mother of invention, the city streets were truly maternal. Kids made use of whatever was around. Even their toys were ingenious adaptations.
We didn't have any money and we had the need. And so we made things out of necessity. I remember learning how to make a carriage wheel wagon. Another little fun vehicle that we used was our skateboard scooter. And the reason for the word the skate was because we took one roller skate, which was a very popular activity in those days. And of course, you got an old one, and you took the one skate apart, and the front section, of course, went on the front of the board, and the rear section went on the rear of the board. And then, of course, we decorated them again with bottle caps, whatever we could lay our hands on. We painted our numbers on them, which some of them was backwards. And here we had flags, and this was our football. And as all it is newspapers rolled and wrapped, and then tied with whatever tape we could lay our hands on as neatly and as decoratively as we could. And that son of a gun would make one hell of a forward pass for any kid that knew how to handle it, and most kids in those days knew how to handle it.
When people needed a break from the neighborhood, that meant Coney Island. Sometimes it was a mini exodus because most of the neighborhood just picked up and went.
Coney Island was like Ebbets Field. It was paradise. From Williamsburg, you had to take the BMT, and it was an elevated line, and it was quite a ride. And you'd get to Stillwell Avenue, and you'd come down those steps, and there were hundreds of barkers.
Hurry, hurry, hurry. It's the one and only Coney Island. It's the big ride. It's the fast ride. It's fun for everybody. It upsets the equilibrium and settles the disposition. It awes you, it fascinates you. It's educational and sensational. It's for every member of the family. Step right up close, folks, for the hand is quicker than the eye. Yes, sir, it's dollars to donuts. You'll have the time of your life at New York's incredible Coney Island.
We'd be there for the whole day, lunch and dinner, and come home late at night. And all the neighbors would go. It would be like a rat pack.
It was packed on the beaches, and everybody had their blankets. And if girls came down there by themselves, it didn't take 2 minutes when there were fellas on the blanket.
For kids, another diversion from the streets was the Saturday matinee in the less than glamorous neighborhood movie house.
You had to satisfy yourself with small things, with 2-cent newspapers, that's what they cost, with cheap movies. You know, you get the third rerun in the neighborhood theater, and every neighborhood, poor neighborhood in New York, all had a theater that everybody called the Itch.
And they give you, for a 2 for a nickel, they give you 3 movies, so shorts, forget about it. They'd have a drawing, and you'd win a bow and arrow, you know, with a rubber tip. And they'd give you an Eskimo pie. And then you'd sit there from 9 or 10 in the morning until your mother or your older brother, they'd be walking through the dark theater, they'd say, "Mush, Irving," everybody, and they'd drag you out.
My mother, who worked as a cashier for one of the RKO theater chains, movie chains, could let us into the movies for free, but she wouldn't let us in unless we got a library card first. So there was a real sense, particularly I think among those immigrant groups, my parents were Irish immigrants, that the way out of whatever poverty you were in went through books, not through other kinds of things. So there was an encouragement that way.
Books and success in school were the first rungs on the ladder most kids were encouraged to climb. The goal was upward mobility, and the means was academic excellence.
We were a bunch of kids that were very competitive, and we were given the best teachers in each department. They got to know us, they took us on trips, and we really got to know these kids, and it was a wonderful group. We were very motivated.
And in the auditorium, there was a sign I never forgot. "What I am to be, I am now becoming." And all my life, I thought of that saying.
I was the copy editor of the newspaper, a very important job. And I just felt as though I was in the middle of the whirlwind. Everything was happening, and I was part of it.
The teachers were all very active in the war effort. We had a production, we called it the Victory Parade.
The war was everyone's preoccupation, but that didn't mean the day-to-day routine of city life disappeared, especially for school kids.
In elementary school also, they had music appreciation. I think it was citywide, as a matter of fact, music appreciation and art appreciation. I think it was the same all over the city. I guess the Metropolitan Museum of Art would give the schools these little prints of their famous art. You would paste it on a piece of construction paper, and underneath you would write the name of the painting, the artist, and a little something, description about it. And you were marked for neatness. I remember that.
The first day of school offered the most perplexing rite of all, filling out a small card whose name is etched in every high school kid's brain, the Delaney card. But no one ever found out who Delaney was. Most of the schools were built before the Great Depression in a grandiose style that gave kids the sense they were stepping into someplace special. They were places where neighborhood identity and pride came together. School rivalry was just neighborhood rivalry brought to the athletic fields.
This is the place where most of the interscholastic athletics, all the competitions, took place outdoors here at the PSAL field. As a matter of fact, many years ago, I ran and played football on this field. The field has changed considerably now. There's that AstroTurf field you see out there. In the old days, it was just dirt. And we used to, with our garden trowels, dig our starting holes. In those days, the competition in the New York City school system was awfully, awfully good. I played against some of the greatest football players in football.
The city championship game was held in Ebbets Field, or the Polo Grounds, or Yankee Stadium. Crowds of 20,000 or more rooted wildly for their schools in a clash of neighborhood loyalties. Except for excursions to the ballpark or Coney or Times Square, a great many New Yorkers pass their entire lives in the neighborhood. Even in such a crowded environment, the human spirit freely expressed itself.
It is the proximity that makes it unique. If you gathered up from your own suburban town, if that's where you live, all the people in that town, and put them together and made them live that way next to one another, it would change their lives dramatically. They would know one another better. They would probably resent one another more. They would irritate one another more. They'd learn to love more profoundly if they were all jammed into a smaller space.
There's something timeless about the great music and dance of the 40s and 50s. The waltz, the foxtrot, and the Latin dances were born in Europe and South America, but the Harlem-born Lindy was quintessential New York.
My name is Harry Connor, and I'm one of the original Savoy dancers.
We danced all the dances that they have out now, but the Lindy Hop was the thing because there were so many ways you could do it, so many acrobatic things you could do with it. The Lindy Hop was energy.
I wanted desperately to go up to the Savoy Ballroom, which for me was a dancer's mecca. And this lady sitting next to me that had come up with me too, she seemed like a very staid type. Nevertheless, I said, can you do this kind of Lindy hopping? She says, oh, I'll try. Well, we got out on the floor and she cut me to shreds. I thought I was going to be showing her, and she wanted to be a terrific dancer. We went off the floor.
The Lindy, which celebrated Charles Lindbergh's solo hop over the Atlantic, invited lots of improvisation. Ballrooms around the city drew very different people, all seeking one thing: great afternoon or evening of dance. When that certain something was in the air, partner touched partner, and even strangers lost themselves in music, movement, and each other. The musicians who played the great music hardly ever had it made. They hustled for gigs.
If you want to be a musician, you got to go where the music is, you know? That sounds reasonable. So we got on a Greyhound bus and left Seattle. It took us about 5 days to come out here. I just kind of found my way into the New York jam session scene, and in the middle of all of this, I became a bass player rather than a valve trombone player, and I started finding a little work.
The most extensive musical environment that ever existed was here in the 40s and 50s. There were hundreds of bands and thousands of musicians working all over the country, and there was music in New York all day and all night for years. And this was the place, actually, if you really wanted to develop yourself to the highest possibility of musical quality, New York was the place to do it.
All the young musicians that I knew were excited about the music and thought that New York was probably the best place in the world because so much of it was going on here. All our heroes were here.
Don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing. It don't mean a thing, all you gotta do is swing. Makes no difference if it's sweet or hot. Just give that rhythm every little thing you've got. It don't mean a thing if you ain't got that swing.
There were jazz clubs right along 57th. They had to hang out at Jimmy Ryan's a lot. They largely featured Dixieland, but a lot of Johnny Roll Morton music. Wilbur de Paris used to play there. A lot of the old-time jazz musicians, and I loved that atmosphere. And then you could go right across the street, and there'd be another club, and maybe there'd be Art Tatum playing. God, I can't tell you how many times I sat in the front row of Birdland on 52nd Street, and I'd buy a beer and sit in the cheap bleachers, what they call the bleacher seats. You cradle the beer between your feet, and then this bassy band would come on, and the first number, I mean, the music would hit you in such a wave.
If Count Basie came to town, everybody wanted to be there. And they were standing there next to each other, you know, and they were relating to each other in a different way. That music brought people together.
When the older jazz or swing began to die out, I mean, by that time there was a new music being developed up at Minton's in Harlem. And a number of players like Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Thelonious Monk, Kenny Clark, and so on were up there. And they developed a music which eventually became what they call bebop music. Now, bebop music, at its very best, is difficult for a dancer to dance to. I'm very dance-oriented. I love to listen to it, and it was kind of a cerebral music. So all of a sudden you went into nightclubs and you could see the change. The little postage stamp dance floors were disappearing, and you'd walk in and there'd be some very cool solo being played by someone, and everybody be sitting there very intently listening, and the whole atmosphere has changed. It was cool. It was very cool.
For lots of young people, there was something wrong with bebop. It was only for listening. But a new, very danceable beat was starting to rock New York. You didn't have to spend a lot of money dancing or going to night spots to enjoy the city. Simply walking the streets was a great adventure. With so much diverse humanity, so much unpredictable activity, you never knew what you'd see, but you could always count on something remarkable. City streets were a feast for the senses, each stimulated in surprising and unexpected ways.
Manhattan was a fairyland for us kids. My father would take the kids on a Sunday, and we'd get for 3 cents over the bridge, start on Delancey Street, and start walking up the Bowery, 4th Avenue, and walk to 42nd Street. That was a Sunday.
There was one place where the music, the glitter, the urgency that was New York City all came together, and that was Times Square.
Just to walk and then look at Times Square with the signs, you know, and the crowds of people and the theaters.
Times Square was lights, the entire spectrum of color intensified. Lights that turned night into perpetual day, and a few square blocks of Manhattan into the Emerald City of Oz.
The people who work on our signs take a great personal pride in saying, I made that with my own hands. Each one feels that he or she personally built the item. Artcraft Strauss was founded in 1897 when horse cars still ran on Broadway. Our early sign work in those days was gaslight and gold leaf. We've built just about every big sign in the Times Square area since the turn of the century. Each spectacular sign has to be more spectacular than the one that went before it. The most famous sign we ever built is the smoking camel sign, which blew smoke rings out over the crowd. People say that Times Square is the lobby of the whole theater district, and it is. The minute you set foot in there, you feel that something magical is happening, and it's partly the lights.
You know, they say there's a broken heart for every light on Broadway. They say Broadway is the longest street with the shortest memory. But I remember when on the hottest summer day of these 42nd Street theaters. 1 second. Hello? Yeah. Okay, Jake, only 1 hour, 1 hour.
Times Square is a lot more than bricks and mortar. It's really a gathering place and a place that represents a spirit.
Masses gathered there spontaneously to mourn when FDR died and to celebrate VJ Day. People, even in our supposedly cold and heartless city, needed a public place, a commons, to cry, to dance, to embrace, to kiss.
My first job when I was a child and had just learned how to type was running the traveling signs on election night in 1956. Eisenhower was running against Stevenson.
The news circling the Times building was the city's town crier.
From inside the office, I could hear the crowd cheering or booing and carrying on every time the new statistics would be typed out. I felt very, very important to be providing information to so many people.
Just walking around, getting swept up in the sights and sounds of the crossroads of the world was stimulating.
When I started the business, I was quite young, but from 42nd Street, 43rd and Broadway, you could walk from the Paramount Theater, big time. This is all going on at the same time, mind you. Then you'd walk up a couple of blocks and there was the Strand Theater. And there, while Benny Goodman was probably at the Paramount or Harry James was at the Paramount, you had Jimmy Dorsey or Cab Calloway or Count Basie at the, also a movie and a stage show, a variety show at the Strand. If you went up a few more blocks going north was the Capitol Theater, which was a tremendous showplace. And then you'd cut it, and then right across the street from the Capitol Theater was the famous Lindy's.
Lindy's was the big restaurant on Broadway. You'd walk there at night, you would see Georgie Jessel, you'd see Walter Winchell.
Lindy's was the famous Cheesecake Lindy, Leo Lindy. And again, Leo had a book like Mr. Sagosky. All the struggling actors, you know, he'd come in and say, all right, you pay me next week, and he'd keep a tab on you.
Finding an affordable place to eat in Midtown was never a problem. In fact, it was even possible to have a simple meal transformed into a futuristic adventure.
My grandfather was Frank Hardart, and he and Joseph Horn got together in Philadelphia, and I think they did $14 worth of business the first day.
It was a modest enough beginning to what became a bonanza of nickels. In 1902, Frank Hardart brought a duplicate of an automated food dispenser he saw in Germany to the U.S. A decade later, the first automat opened in New York City.
The automat was received in New York without reservation, and New York made the automat really, made it their own.
The automats were opulent and clean. They served people of all social classes good food that was healthy, ample, and cheap.
You'd go to a change person. You'd put 50 cents down or a quarter down to give you 5 nickels, and they used to throw them out like, like they were shooting crab, and they were marvelous. They'd see you put a quarter down, and they just throw, and it would be 5 nickels, and they could control them by manipulation of the hands.
It was a very open door. It was one of the most remarkable places in that there was always room for one more. And it was fast food when it was fast and when it was food. This was the first Nintendo. This was the first realization that you could excite people so much through their visual sense that you could draw them right into your world. This was a way of putting the product right in front of the person, tempting them so much to take it that they just had to grab it.
I always remember the best baked beans in the world for a nickel, a roll for a nickel, and a coffee for a nickel. For 15 cents, you had a feast.
The automat was more than just a place to eat. It was also a place that people could gather. It was also a refuge. It was also a place where people could go if they had no other place to go. And it was also a place where people who were very rich and very poor could sit down together at the same table.
There were sometimes long tables for 6 and 8, and when they were filled, you took an empty seat, and you might be talking to a college professor or the president of a company, and next to him might be just somebody who's really down on their luck.
The idea was that everybody was allowed. The idea was here was an open door. The idea was stay as long as you want. Here was America emerging into the 20th century. Everything was going to be fresh. Everything was going to be made very beautifully. Everything was going to be accessible to people. It was a great statement of optimism about what America was supposed to be. And to a certain extent, it was realized.
I remember on the hottest summer day when air conditioning was nowhere near what it is today, the people would go to a movie theater or a legitimate theater on 42nd Street, women with gowns, men with jackets and ties and almost top hats, and that was known as elegant theater going. Hello? Who's this? Jack. I'm being filmed by 60 Minutes, Jay. So, this is 60 Minutes, right?
An important rite of passage was seeing your first Broadway show. It usually marked the beginning of a love affair with live dramas and musicals, and Broadway had them.
In those days, you paid $1.20, sat in the last row, and you saw everything. Every Saturday that we were able to, we'd go over to Broadway, and we'd see every show. As a result, I saw Death of a Salesman with Lee Cobb. I saw every musical, Oklahoma, Carousel, Finian's Rainbow, Cry the Beloved Country, all these wonderful shows when they opened.
You have to wait sometimes 3 years to get tickets, but I was patient. I waited for my tickets, and then we go to the Roxy. The admission was 25 cents. 25 cents till 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Hello?
In a life of hard work and doing without, going to a Times Square movie theater was a leap from the mundane to the magical.
Movie openings were a very big deal in those days. Unlike today, when a movie opens across the country in thousands of theaters simultaneously, movies would have a first run on Broadway, so that when the movie was released elsewhere, they would promote it by saying, coming to you after a fabulous 44 weeks on Broadway, or whatever it was.
Times Square theaters offered on-screen dreams, famous bands and stage performers, all with a side order of news, cartoons, and shorts thrown in. Even our wonder was inexpensive. We jammed in together every New Year's Eve with our friends, neighbors, and our mutual hopes for the future. Sustained by our closeness, we waited impatiently for the descent of the great ball that would usher in America's ever-promising new year.
With the ball of lights. It doesn't look as if it started to move yet. The New York Times electrician consults his watch, you know, and at 20 seconds before midnight, he pushes the button, and there it comes, slowly descending. Listen to the roar now. This is it, the magic moment.
Stand by. This is it.
All right, Ralph.
4 great cars, Plymouth, Dodge, DeSoto, and Chrysler, present to you Major Edward Bowes and his original amateur hour. Major?
Thank you, Ralph, and good evening, friends. Now spins our weekly Wheel of Fortune. Around she goes, and where she stops, nobody knows.
If one picture is worth 1,000 words, radio was a really powerful medium because it consisted of both words and pictures. Listeners flashed the pictures on the screen of their minds and became both creator and spectator. That's why half a century later, people still can't shake their radio days.
And I would come home at 4:45 to listen to the serials every evening. They had, you know, Jack Armstrong and Captain Midnight and Captain Silver and the Sea Hound and those things. And they went from basically 4:45 to about 6.
Tom Corbett, Space Cadet. Brought to you by Kellogg's Pep, the built-up wheat cereal. Tom Corbett, Space Cadet, starring Frankie Thomas, can also be seen on television and appears in the comic sections of many of America's leading newspapers.
I used to run down to the theaters, to the radio theaters, to watch Dr. IQ. He was a man on the stage. He was a rapid-fire announcer, and the big phrase was, "I have a lady in the balcony, doctor." He had 5 assistants roaming through the theaters with portable microphones, and there were all these eager contestants yelling to get on the show. And if they got the correct answer, they would get either 5 to 25 silver dollars, or else if they didn't get the right answer, they would get a box of Snickers.
What both newspapers and radio did that television later did not do was to force your imagination to work.
Show the trivia my air raid warden's helmet, Molly.
I wouldn't know where to look for it, dearie.
Oh, I know where it is. It's right here in the hall closet.
Oh, no, no.
straighten out that closet one of these days.
There was no picture doing it for you. There was no pictures to spell it out and show you how to do it. So your imagination, I think, was much more part of the process, and therefore I think in a way it was a creative act to be a listener to radio, and a creative act obviously to be a reader, because you were taking abstract words and making pictures in your head out of them.
Tell me, Mr. Moody, what are your feelings about the radio?
I don't hold with it, Bub.
Displeases you?
I don't hold with furniture that talks.
Well, you...
Sometimes the furniture known as radio provided an indispensable public service, as when Mayor LaGuardia urgently addressed the citizens.
Here is wet wash. The doors of the laundry wagon are open. He's leaning with his back toward the wagon, and he's counting his money. 2, 3, 4,000. Now he's getting into the hundreds. 600, 700, 800. And the picture shows a hand of Breathless stretching out. She's got hold of that iron pot. Remember the iron pot she took from the Van Hoosen's gardener's flat to put the money in. And crash! She crashes on his head. Knocked out.
There were more than a dozen daily newspapers, papers of every stripe in the political spectrum. There were morning papers, evening papers, and late-night bulldog editions. There were even papers in a variety of foreign languages, most intriguing of which was the daily Forward, the Yiddish language paper that was actually read backward.
The pink edition of the Daily News, it was 2 cents. And everybody would look for there and see, geez, my horse didn't come in. What numbers came in? Shucks, I missed it by 1. And then everybody would hang around for a while, and then they would go home. And then at Saturday night, people made a business of delivering the news, the Mirror. Nobody bought the Times then. I mean, it was just too sophisticated. But the News, the Mirror was 5 cents. Some families, if they were working, would buy 2 papers.
Waiting for the paper offered a chance to stop off for a beer, or to gather at the newsstand and talk about sports or politics.
The candy store always had a rack out front with all the newspapers, and there were a lot of newspapers then. At the end of the war, there were basically 12 newspapers in New York City. Brooklyn had its own paper, the Brooklyn Eagle, which I delivered started delivering when I was 11 and 12. The Bronx had its own paper, the Bronx Home News, and the Journal American, which was a Hearst paper, was very heavy Catholic paper, and was thought of by the liberals in town as if the publisher was Francisco Franco or something. The New York Post, which was the liberal paper, people thought that Joe Stalin was the editor of the Post. So there was particularly in the afternoon papers, a heavy political identity. Walter Winchell was probably the biggest star in the United States at that time for the combination of the gossip column and the radio show that he had.
Flash, Washington. When he learned that Nancy knew dealer Howland Spencer sold 500 acres near Hyde Park to Father Devine's Angels, intimates say that FDR smiled and said, well, it is good to know we will have some nice neighbors for a change.
In New York City, the powerful combination of radio and newspapers influenced most people's attitudes about many things. But the home team radio announcers and the local sports pages pushed the already bitter baseball rivalries to a new ferocity. Everybody had a fierce loyalty to one of the 3 teams, and hatred of the other 2. No city before or since has been able to support 3 major league teams. Brooklyn had the Dodgers, Manhattan the Giants, and the Yankees were the Bronx Bombers. During the regular season, the most bitter rivalry was between the National League Giants and Dodgers. They and their fans would take turns tormenting each other. The enmity ran so deep that when Jackie Robinson was traded from the Dodgers to the Giants in 1956, he simply refused to go. When the Dodgers lost the World Series to the Yankees, as they usually did, 1 million Brooklynites would mutter, "We was robbed," and "Wait till next year."
It was inconceivable that anybody would root for anybody except the Dodgers. There were always these rumors that maybe 7 or 8 or 10 blocks away there was a Yankee fan, and if you went another 10 blocks, you'd find a Republican.
I was a Yankee fan. I would sit on the milk box. You sit on that because the radio is up on the shelf behind the milk case. And you had to put your ear right next to it because my father thought baseball was a dilettante's delight. You know, who had time for baseball?
The rivalry between the Dodgers and the Giants, and then between the Dodgers and the Yankees, was awesome. It was like something you cannot believe. And we as fans in Brooklyn felt we were better to the extent that we were more knowledgeable about the team and about baseball. Obviously, we weren't any brighter than people living in the Bronx, but that was our perception. We were better fans because no matter what the Dodgers did, we were behind them 100%.
So we'd walk all the way to the ballpark and walk all the way back, right across Prospect Park. And we thought that would go on forever. You know, we thought it would go on forever. We thought it was a period where the three of the greatest teams of baseball were all in New York.
In schoolyards, workplaces, and taverns throughout the city, debates raged over which team had the better players. Was it Reese or Rizzuto, Berra or Campanella, Willie, Mickey, or the Duke? You were born a Dodger, a Giant, or a Yankee fan, and usually you died that way. Giants fans were loyalists, plain and simple. Their glory days were in the 20s and 30s, yet they clung to the quiet hope that lightning would strike once more. It did in the memorable playoff game of 1951, when Bobby Thompson's miracle home run beat the Dodgers. The Dodgers, nicknamed Dem Bums, were the soul and spirit of Brooklyn and expressed the deepest needs and desires of their fans. Like Brooklyn itself, the Dodgers were the most human and quirky of teams.
We used to pay 60 cents to go to a ball game, $2.50 maybe for the box seats. But then one day, this bunch of fellas came in with musical instruments, and they were thrown out of the ballpark. They had a bass drum, trumpet and everything, and my brother Shorty got them back in. And he made them come under his section there, section 8. They couldn't read music, and they just made noise. And Shorty would lead the band, and also with little Jojo Delia, they would get up and start jitterbugging. They'd have a top hat on and a tuxedo on. They looked like bums. The fans loved them. That's how the symphony was born down there.
And they would get on the umpires and the opposing players, and they would generally create an atmosphere of goodwill. Another aspect would be Happy Felton's Knothole Gang, which before each home game, Happy down the right field line by the bullpen would try out 3 ball players at the same position, 3 children from a high school or Little League, and he'd have one of the Dodgers come and select the one that showed the most talent. Abe Stark had a clothing store, and to advertise his store, he put a sign out there, hit this sign and win a suit. And he made a deal with Carl Furillo, the greatest fielding right fielder that had ever lived. If he prevented the opposing ball players from hitting the sign, Abe would in turn give Carl a suit or 2. When Jackie Robinson was signed in 1947, it was quite a thing. The first black player to play in the major leagues. And we were all very happy because it was in Brooklyn.
Jackie Robinson carried the banner for generations of black athletes who had been excluded from Major League Baseball. While suffering racial humiliations from opponents and even some of his first-year teammates, Robinson's baseball brilliance was his most eloquent response. Ultimately, another team would have signed the first black player, but Brooklyn was proud that it was the Dodgers and Robinson.
And he played with a really fine Brooklyn Dodger team that had Duke Snyder in center field at the same time that the Giants had Willie Mays and the Yankees had Mickey Mantle. Now, you want to define excellence and the superlative nature of New York, there it was. 3 of the greatest center fielders that ever lived, all playing at the same time in the same town.
There was something inconceivable about being a Yankee fan. It was like, somebody once said, it was like rooting for United States Steel.
The Yankees were the consummate pros, efficient, extremely talented, businesslike, and predictably successful. Yankee fans identified with those virtues. They were taunted by Giant and Dodger fans as pinstriped corporate types to whom the bottom line, winning, was everything. One Yankee was always immune from scorn.
He was an icon, DiMaggio. He represented excellence of achievement. He represented that magnificently quiet glamour. He represented the ability of the ethnics. His father was a fisherman, to make it. He represented a lot, and he was very important to me. And so I became a baseball player.
The legend of Joe D. was so powerful that even Ernest Hemingway used him to inspire the Cuban fisherman in The Old Man and the Sea. DiMaggio was, for Hemingway, as well as for Paul Simon decades later, the essence and embodiment of grace under pressure.
Where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? A nation turns its lonely eyes to you. What's that you say? Mrs. Robinson, Jolton Joe has gone away. But what he meant, Simon, was that the heroes all left.
New York ball players were larger than life, but at the same time were real members of the community. Some drove to games, others took the subway. In Brooklyn, some players simply walked to Ebbets Field.
They lived in the borough. Their children attended the public schools. Their wives shopped in the local stores. They had part-time jobs off-season in the borough. So they were part of the family of Brooklyn people.
One of the things that happened later when they left in 1956 and 57, when it was announced and then they left finally, was the sense that what we believed was an almost religious connection to all these teams was not.
Mr. O'Malley,
Mr. O'Malley, greetings from the citizens of Los Angeles.
Appreciate the enthusiasm with which you greeted the announcement that the Dodgers would play their National League games here next year. And I just hope for all of you an early World Series championship team. Don't know just when we can do it, but we're going to give it an awful good try. So thanks to everybody for being so nice to us.
When the Dodgers left, O'Malley was probably the greatest single villain in the history of the borough of Brooklyn. He promised that he was going to leave the Dodgers in Brooklyn while he was negotiating in California.
The disillusion was like unbelievable. It's hard to explain to anybody now, and maybe it's not worth even bothering about anymore, but it was one of the great, wounds to the morale of the town that took us decades to recover from.
The Polo Grounds and Ebbets Field yielded to the wrecking ball and only exist, like most sorrowful legends, in memory, story, and song.
I come from Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is out of this world. Let's root for the Dodgers, don't cry in your beer. We're gonna do it, we'll win it this year. I come from Brooklyn, and that's a great place to come from.
How do you measure a person's life, or the life of a generation? Usually, it's by what we've gained. But very often, it's by what's been lost. By what time and circumstance have stolen. If we're lucky, it's also by what we can hold on to, what we remember. For a brief while, once upon a time in New York, it was wonderful.